Today at the National Press Club, Christopher Pyne, a minister under the Howard, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments. He's now the chair of COTA Australia, the peak body advocating for older people. He'll present the findings from the State of the Older Nation report. Christopher Pyne with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is Tom Connell. I'm the club's president and also an anchor at Sky News Australia. Our guest today, Christopher Pyne. He's the chair of the Council of the Ageing and he'll be presenting the findings of the State of the Older Nation report. Older Australians on one level have seemingly never been more needed, often called on for free babysitting or childcare. I would give a shout out to my mum, but she's skiing, of course. Increasingly needed to help for a house deposit, if possible. Economists are asking them to work later in life and help the economy, and the Treasurer's been eyeing their superannuation nest eggs. There's another very different side to ageing in Australia, which we'll hear about as well today. 1 in 4 people, mainly women, aged over 50, living in poverty, and those wanting to work later, often encountering ageism again. Christopher was, of course, formerly a member of the House for 26 years, leaving Parliament in 2019, a minister in the Howard, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments. He held portfolios including ageing, education and industry, innovation and science. Author of 2 books, thrice named in the AFR magazine's Power List of the top 10 most powerful people in Australia. And before he gets a big head, of course, infamously once put his own, had to put his own lemon in a gin and tonic. So we'll hear about all of that and I'm sure more. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Christopher Pyne.
Thank you very much, Tom, and it's lovely to be back here at the National Press Club. I think this is my 4th appearance here over my career, but the first not as a minister in a government. But may I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters and community. Since the Second World War, there was a senator called Senator Bill Bradley for New Jersey in the United States. He was a Rhodes Scholar, he was a National Basketball League champion, and he was one of the very first senators at the age of 30, which is the minimum age that you have to be a US senator. And in that very hallowed state, he was at a black tie dinner in Washington where he was the guest speaker. So he was sitting up on the head table, feeling quite pleased with himself. And the waiter was coming around delivering pats of butter. And he put a pat of butter down on Senator Bradley's side plate. And Senator Bradley said, "I'd like 2 pats of butter, please." And the waiter said, "1 person, 1 pat of butter." And Senator Bradley said, "Well, perhaps you don't know who I am." And the waiter said, "No, as a matter of fact, I don't." He said, "Well, I'm Senator Bill Bradley. I'm the youngest senator in the US Senate at the age of 30. I'm a former Rhodes Scholar, National Basketball League champion. I'm in the National Basketball League Hall of Fame, and I'd like 2 pats of butter." And the waiter said, "Perhaps you don't know who I am, Senator." And the senator said, "No, I don't." He said, "I'm the guy who's in charge of the butter." So in my current role, I now feel I'm on both sides of that story because I've been the Minister for Ageing in what was described as the golden age of the Howard government when I was the Minister for 1 year in the Howard era. And I'm, of course, now a representative of Ageing Australia here at the Press Club launching the SOTON report. But here's a simple observation. Despite some of us maintaining our youthful good looks better than others, we are getting older. Not just each of us in this room, but Australians as a whole. When we talk about older Australians, we mean people aged over 50. How surprising that feels usually depends on how old you are yourself. The most recent intergenerational report found that the proportion of older Australians is rapidly increasing. The latest version tells us that the share of Australians aged 65 and over is set to more than double by the 2060s. And the number of people aged 85 and over is expected to triple. Australia's ageing population is often framed as a problem, but in reality, it's a remarkable achievement, a tribute to modern science, medicine and public health. Living longer is something to celebrate. It's that we're still thinking about ageing in dangerously old-fashioned and simplistic ways. Too often, the story of older Australians is reduced to one of two basic plot lines. The first goes like this: older people, often framed as baby boomers, are wealthy, secure, asset-rich, sitting on housing, insulated from economic pressure and blocking opportunities for younger generations. The second sits at the opposite extreme. Older people, often those in their late 70s and 80s, are portrayed as frail, dependent, in nursing homes, clogging hospital beds and placing an unsustainable burden on public resources. At first glance, these stories seem to contradict one another, but in truth, they share something important. They are both wrong, and together they flatten the experience of later life into two crude caricatures: wealth or weakness, leaving no room for the lived reality of most older Australians. These stereotypes persist, not because they are accurate, but because they are convenient. They ignore the community and economic contribution of older people, simplify complex policy changes, and allow us to avoid uncomfortable conversations about inequality and disadvantage. I took on the chair of the role of as chair of COTA Australia, the Council on the Ageing, in 2023, in part because I wanted to help challenge that thinking. In my role, I see firsthand how these labels shape policy and how poorly they match reality. At COTA, we hear every day from people whose lives bear no resemblance to either stereotype, people who are working, caring, volunteering, contributing, adapting, and in many cases, quietly struggling. We hear from people like Nancy in her mid-60s. After her marriage broke down, she wasn't left with much. Her health suffered and she wasn't able to work. She's now working casually when she can, but it's not enough to pay the rent by herself, so she's living with her daughter. While her daughter is very supportive, money is tight, and with Nancy's ongoing health issues, she's often making choices between seeing the doctor, cutting back on her regular medication, or buying groceries. Or we hear from people like Bob, who was made redundant from his job at 58. He'd spent most of his working life with the one employer and didn't think he'd have much trouble landing a new job with his skills and experience, but he was wrong. He spent more than 2 years applying for jobs, and after 12 months he began to lower his expectations, and even then he couldn't crack an interview. Bob was living off his retirement savings and not eligible for any government support, including retraining. For someone that still had much to contribute, Bob was demoralised and felt like the world had written him off. COTA Australia exists to advance the rights, well-being and inclusion of people like Bob and Nancy, of all older people. And central to that work is telling these stories we hear, telling the truth about ageing in Australia. And that's why we produced the State of the Older Nation report, which can be seen, a copy of which can be seen on the cota.org.au website. The State of the Older Nation is a biennial survey commissioned by COTA Australia, conducted by SEC Newgate and supported by Aware Super. And thank you to Aware Super for supporting such an important initiative. It's a nationally representative survey of Australians aged 50 to 99. And that age range matters. Too often, researchers, statisticians and government data collections lump everyone over 65 or 75 into a single category, as though a 70-year-old and a 90-year-old are living the same life. We would never accept that kind of grouping earlier in life, yet we routinely do it later, reinforcing the idea that older people are all the same. Imagine suggesting that a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old were living the same life. Perhaps if you were Rod Stewart, that might actually pertain, but not for most people. The latest State of the Older Nation report follows reports from 2018, 21 and 23. And this time around, it does contain some good news. Compared to the last two waves of the survey, which were conducted during and immediately after COVID, older Australians are feeling more positive about their own lives. More than 3/4 now rate their quality of life as high, and optimism about the future has rebounded towards pre-pandemic levels. That matters. It tells us many people are recovering from years of disruption, uncertainty and isolation, which is fantastic. But if we stop there, we miss the real story, because what we also see in the data is that these improvements are not shared evenly. The real headline from this year's report is that while public debate often focuses on intergenerational fairness, younger versus older, the data exposes a different divide, one we rarely acknowledge, which is intragenerational inequality. That is inequity faced by people within the one generation. This report shows that financial security, housing stability, health, digital access, confidence and social connection vary dramatically among people aged 50 and over, and it also varies between men and women. And remarkably, it finds that nearly 1 in 4 older Australians are living in poverty. And that is not a marginal group, and it's completely incompatible with the cliché of universal boomer wealth. Older Australians experiencing financial hardship consistently report lower quality of life, poorer physical and mental health, weaker social connections, higher loneliness, and they're more likely to be renting, and they have greater difficulty accessing health care and medication. These disadvantages compound, and once someone falls behind, it becomes much harder to catch up. What the data shows is a three-way split. Around 3 in 10 older Australians are doing well financially. 1/4 are in poverty, which leave the rest sitting somewhere in the middle, managing but very much exposed to shocks and risks. This reality should sit uncomfortably with everyone, and it certainly sits uncomfortably with the rich boomer narrative. But it is the reality of all of us, including policymakers, that we must confront. Another strong thread running through the latest report is ageism. We know that ageism is something that impacts people of every generation, both directly and indirectly, and older Australians often feel it acutely. Nearly half of older Australians feel less valued by society than when they were younger. More than half believe government policies do not meet the needs of people their age. Almost 2 in 5 report experiencing ageism since turning 50, most commonly in employment, but also in health systems, in government services, in business services and in everyday life. Ageism isn't just offensive, it's not just unfair, it has real, measurable consequences for individuals and societies. It shows up in different ways, in the way we ourselves think about ageing and older people, and the stereotypes and limits we put on ourselves and others. Sometimes it's overt or systemic, and sometimes what's called benevolent ageism, when people are well-intentioned but make assumptions that still limit choice and independence. No matter how it shows up, the critical point is this: ageism impacts all of us. It's not just an older people's issue. People of all ages experience ageism. And when ageism is targeted at older people, it stops them from contributing, which hurts people of every generation. Take the workplace, for example. When older Australians are excluded from work, we lose skills, experience and mentoring. The State of the Older Nation report found that 33% of people retired earlier than they planned, and around 22% of retirees say they'd consider returning to work, but among them, more than a third cite ageism as the reason why they wouldn't even try. In a nation that is desperately in need of more skilled workers, we can ill afford to be discouraging older people from staying in the workforce, retraining or losing them from where their skills are needed. This need is particularly acute in hospitality, in construction and in industry, like the defence industry. The workforce statistics in the report also highlight one of the areas where we see a big gender divide. Retired men are significantly more likely than women to say they don't need to work, which may reflect the gender gap in retirement savings. We also know that women typically retire with less super and live longer, which means many women are stretching smaller savings across more years. That's exactly that kind of risk that stereotypes hide. More work is needed to understand what would close this gendered retirement age gap, like the work the government has been doing on closing the retirement income gap faced by many women. If we're serious about unlocking the benefits of our ageing society, ageism in employment is an area we need to focus on. When policy is shaped by stereotypes, it creates systems that fail people at every stage of life. Ageism is a life cycle problem. What harms people later in life ultimately harms all of us eventually. There are few areas in which this is clearer than in housing. Housing is often cited as proof of boomer privilege, yet nearly 1 in 5 older Australians rent. And in the State of the Older Nation report, renters report dramatically lower security and affordability. Only half feel secure, and fewer than half consider their housing affordable. And despite the stereotype, very few older Australians are living off property income. Fewer than 1% report rental income as their main source of income, and it only rises to 8% when included as a secondary source. Housing impacts both genders differently too. Tragically, older women are now amongst the fastest growing groups at risk of homelessness. These are women who may have raised families, often worked in lower paid or insecure jobs, taken time out of caring and reached later life with less superannuation and fewer buffers. Having access to safe and affordable housing should be achievable for everyone, no matter what year you were born. Housing insecurity in later life is not just distressing, it's destabilising. It affects health, employment, social connection and dignity, and it ripples outwards, increasing pressure on services and communities. The same pattern is visible in health. The State of the Older Nation report showed that almost half of older Australians had difficulty accessing health care in the past year, mainly due to cost and long wait lists. 1 in 7 delayed or skipped medication because they couldn't afford it. We know that that's also true when it comes to oral health, with dental services being the health service older Australians cited most frequently as the health service they are least able to access. And we know that a lack of oral health care can lead to serious health complications down the track. As we live longer, the importance of preventative health becomes even more critical for our quality of life and our healthcare system. These are not fringe experiences, they are structural problems. The State of the Older Nation report also includes important findings about aged care, and this is an area where timing really matters. When the survey was conducted, 90% of older Australians who were receiving home care packages were overwhelmingly positive about their experiences. And that finding is good and important, and it shouldn't be dismissed. It provides a valuable benchmark to measure future sentiment about the reforms that are currently being implemented. But we also need to be honest about what it does not capture. The survey was conducted before the recent aged care reform was implemented. While today is about the State of the Older Nation report, it would be irresponsible not to briefly acknowledge what we're hearing now from older people about the rollout of the aged care reforms. Since the 1st of November, when the reforms came into effect, we've heard growing concern from older people and their families about the implementation of the aged care reform, including concerns about older people having to pay for basics like showering and about waiting lists for support being far too long. No one should ever have to wait longer than 30 days for the basic care that they need. Given the timing of the State of the Older Nation fieldwork, I don't want to focus on aged care too much, other than to say it's something we'll be watching closely. And this cannot be seen as a partisan issue. The scale of the problem is such that it's always going to take time, and we need politicians across the board to work together to ensure older people get quality, affordable aged care when they need it. But let's return to the State of the Older Nation report. The findings also remind us that social connection is as important as physical health. Almost half of older Australians reported feeling lonely at least some of the time in recent weeks. Technology plays a critical role in maintaining connection, but the report shows digital confidence and access are uneven, particularly among women and those no longer in the workforce. For many people, digital exclusion isn't about convenience, it's about isolation. Loneliness is not inevitable in later life, but it becomes far more likely when people lack support, access and inclusion. There are real practical implications when it comes to having the confidence to engage digitally. The SOTON report found that 86% of older people who took the survey are confident using technology to access services online. Things like online banking, making health appointments, reporting income to Centrelink, which is good. But it also means that around 14% do not feel confident using digital services. And that's obviously a bare minimum, because you've got to remember the people who took part in our survey was conducted online, are more likely to be confident online. No one is against advances in technology, but we do need to make sure that people, including our most vulnerable, aren't left behind in that progress. With the rise of AI systems, we'll see further automation, and there is a genuine fear that this will mean people relying on government will themselves become pieces of data rather than humans. As you can see, the State of the Older Nation report cuts through the myths of wealth and weakness to reveal a much more complex reality, and that reality demands different policy responses. The findings show that ageing in Australia is working well for some, but too many are being left behind. If ageing policy continues to be shaped by stereotypes, we will keep designing blunt systems that fail the people who most need support, and will miss the opportunity to harness the contribution of millions of Australians. As Chair of COTA Australia, I believe we need to lift our ambition. What's required now, at the very least, is a 10-year whole-of-government plan for an ageing Australia, one that is co-designed with older Australians, not designed for them. And this must go well beyond aged care. Ageing cuts across housing, health, employment, transport, digital inclusion, income security and community connection. And our response needs to be just as connected. At a minimum, a 10-year plan should include clear, measurable actions across government, business and civil society, with transparent accountability for delivery, not aspirations but commitments that can be tracked over time. It should include a national research program to properly map the presence and impact of ageist laws, policies and practices that may still exist, and to quantify both the prevalence and cost of ageism. That includes identifying cohorts most at risk, such as older women forced into early retirement with far less financial security. And it should include dedicated funding for evidence-based prevention, including public awareness initiatives to reduce ageism, tackle discrimination and lift visibility of the issue across the community. Because prevention matters, addressing ageism early reduces pressure later on health systems, aged care, income support and families. It's not just the right thing to do, it's also smart policy. The State of the Older Nation is not just a snapshot of older Australians today, it is a glimpse of Australia's future. If we're lucky, everyone in this room and those watching at home will be older one day. The systems we design now are the systems we will rely on later. The laws that we pass now are the ones that will shape our own security and dignity. And the stereotypes that we tolerate today are the ones that will limit our own lives tomorrow. So here's my challenge to all of us. How do we choose to see older Australians? People who've built skills, knowledge and experience over a lifetime? Do we keep viewing them through the same tired frames as either winners or burdens, victors or victims? Or do we finally recognise the extraordinary potential we're sitting on? Because older Australians are not a problem to be managed. They are a resource to be valued, a resource to be tapped. When we create opportunities for mentoring, volunteering, flexible and structured work, roles that reflect how people actually want to contribute later in life, we don't just support older Australians. We strengthen workplaces, we strengthen communities and we strengthen the generations coming after them. A 10-year action plan for an ageing Australia would be a powerful signal that we're ready to make that shift, not just to respond to ageing, but to harness it. Because the true test of a mature nation is not how it treats its people at their peak, but how it values them across the whole of life. And when we build systems that work as we age, we build a society that works better for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. So the report reconfirms, or perhaps confirms, that the situation in terms of retirement and as to whether you have your own home or not, it's only getting worse if you're a renter. Is there a point at time where that needs to be addressed, major changes? Because that's the case mainly because of government payments. Does that need to be looked at in your view? Is it just too imbalanced as to whether you rent or not? It's almost impossible to have a good retirement if you're a renter.
Yeah, I thought, Tom, two of the things that really leapt out to me in the COTA, I'm going to call it the COTA, although I hate acronyms, but it's easier, is that housing is such an enormous determinant of future wealth or future poverty. And that the whole debate in the press, or the society we live in, is about younger people and their lack of access to housing, maybe till later in life or maybe till not at all, because of the cost of housing and the cost of borrowing. The interest rates, as we know, went up yesterday. But it's also very impactful on older people, as impactful. In fact, if you look at the COTA, the indicator of people being in poverty is largely people who are either still renting or still paying off a mortgage when they're older. So housing is an issue that we have to address, not just for the current generation, but for older generations. And it also gives the lie to the dichotomy that occurs in our public debate, which is that we have generations that are not at war with each other, but one is taking from the other. The idea that older generations are doing really well, and that's really unfair on younger generations. That is an absurd proposition and plays into the stereotypes I talked about in the speech. So addressing housing policy is really important. The second thing that I found quite remarkable was that we still have such an enormous gender gap between men and women amongst older Australians. Because we've done a lot in the time that I got elected in 1993. So in that time, 30 years or more, I feel like we've done a lot to address gender inequality, but it still shows up very...
A lot came too late, I guess, for people's working lives, so that, in one sense...
It's probably the next COTA report in maybe 5 or 10 years, hopefully, will show that that gap has narrowed, but it's still a very big gap.
Just quickly, as a small L Liberal, so ageism in terms of the workplace, in particular around hiring, is there a government role there? I mean, I think of the fact that they publish wages to look at the wage gender gap. Perhaps do you look at publishing how many employees older than a certain age are at a company? Is that a way for a government role there? What do you think?
Well, I think that's a good question to ask as part of this 10-year plan for older Australians, how to move that dial on ageism. As I said in the speech, we need to quantify ageist policies and laws that still exist.
Okay.
But it's also about talking about ageism, because this benevolent ageism, which I mentioned, is something that a lot of people do casually, thinking that they're being nice to people, when in fact they're demonstrating that they're treating older people as though they're different. And we wouldn't tolerate that in many other aspects of our society, and yet we still tolerate it in ageism. And a little example, I don't want to upset Have You Been Paying Attention, but Denise Scott, who's often on Have You Been Paying Attention, which I've done a couple of times, is an older comedian, an older actor, an older person on television, and a lot of the jokes at her expense are about her being older than everybody else. And it's done casually.
It's sort of the shtick, isn't it?
It's supposed to be the shtick. It's supposed to be funny.
Yeah.
But it is actually ageism. And, maybe they might address that.
I've seen the show. I didn't see you on there, so I'm ashamed.
I was on there a couple of times.
I'll have to go back and watch it.
When I used to be somebody.
Now you spent 26 years in the House, but you can still draw a crowd, so I'll get to my colleagues now because they're sick of me asking
I'm not
questions.
sure everyone's here for the SOTON report, though.
Natassia Chrysanthus from the SMH and the Age, first of all.
Well, surprise, surprise. Picking up on those 26 years that you spent in the Liberal Party, many of those in government, today, you know, your party up on the Hill is reduced to a 28-member opposition in the House of Representatives. How did it get to this point? Do you think it can be turned around? And if so, how?
It's a very broad question. Well, I'm still a Liberal. When you say I was a Liberal Party member for 26 years, I've been a Liberal Party member since I was 17 and remain a Liberal Party member. The last election was the worst election for the non-Labor side of politics since 1943. It was beyond a catastrophe, and it got to that point because I think the non-Labor side of politics started to drift away from understanding that to win elections you need to win them from the centre or the centre-right, and started believing that you could move the people to your position rather than being where the people are. I was a member of the Howard government and we won a lot of elections, and John Howard, I think it's fair to say, governed from the centre-right, but won elections from just right of the centre, and the public liked that. And so the idea that the Liberal Party or the National Party can move further to the right and win elections has been sort of slightly disproved, in fact fundamentally disproved, in the last 3 elections. But I'm very optimistic about the Liberal Party. I must be the only person in this room who's optimistic about the Liberal Party, but I am very optimistic about it because we've done this sort of thing before. There's nothing much new under the sun in politics. And we did spend a lot of time in opposition between 1983 and 1996, which people forget, 13 years. And we had this debate back then too. There was quite a debate about the moderates versus the Conservatives, Andrew Peacock versus John Howard. The names were different, the labels were different, but in fact it was the same debate, because it's been the debate about where the Liberal Party lies on the political spectrum since the fusion of the protectionists and the free traders in the early part of Federation. This is the nature of a political spectrum. So they will work themselves out, I'm certain of that, because they have to. And they'll do that when they do 2 things. When they start to dislike the Labor Party more than they dislike each other, which is very important. I don't think I'm breaking news there. And secondly, when they really hate being in opposition, because opposition is really awful. You have no power, and the devil makes work for idle hands, and I think we've been seeing that lately. But they will eventually hate being in opposition, and when they do that, they will realise that they have to be where the people are, and they will win elections again. And I'll address leadership probably in other questions, so I won't keep going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jack Quayle from The Australian.
Thank you very much, Mr Pyne, for your address. And I similarly want to ask about the future of the Liberal Party. I want to ask you about a message you reportedly sent a moderate MPs last month, claiming that the coalition arrangement with the Nationals was not serving the Liberal Party well and hasn't for some time. Why is that the case? Why do you make that observation? And in your view, can the Liberals survive or even be better off without being in coalition with the Nationals?
Well, I always think that a coalition is better than not a coalition, and we've been in coalition with the Nationals and before them the Country Party since 1922. So the last year of dropping out of coalition twice, to use a rather overused word during COVID, is unprecedented, clearly. So I believe a healthy coalition, which is where we need to get back to, is where the National Party wins seats in the country and represents their constituency, which is generally more conservative than the cities, and the Liberals win seats in the city where most of the people live, and at the moment we have 8 out of 89 seats in the city, and the healthy coalition allows both parties to do that. So an unhealthy coalition is one where one party tries to make the other party more like them, and therefore they can't actually fulfil their mandate. The mandate of the Liberal Party is to win seats in the city in more progressive electorates, like my old seat of Sturt, because that's where the voters are. in terms of the political spectrum. They tend to be in the sort of roughly in the centre. My old electorate mostly sort of centre-right. And the Liberal Party needs to be free to do that. And the Nationals need to give them the freedom to do that. And that has been a healthy coalition for most of the last 100 years. And an unhealthy one is when one party tries to insist the other party replicates them. And that is not just not going to work because people are in different parts of the political spectrum. It's also electoral suicide because it means that the Liberal Party will never win seats in the city and will have a permanent one-party state. And that's bad for democracy. I don't hate the Labor Party. I have lots of good friends in the Labor Party. But we don't want a one-party state. It's not good for democracy. So you need governments to change, you need opposition to be strong, and that's best served by a coalition. I'm a traditionalist about that, but the coalition has to be a healthy one.
Thank you very much.
Go to Simon Gross. I'm going to ask his question. He's watching from his sick bed. He's been looking at the COTA website. He notes it says COTA supports a continued CGT discount at some level. Changes to the current level should have a clear rationale with clear societal benefits. What would the benefits be, perhaps, of what's being mooted today? A reduction, perhaps, in it down to 33% and funneling that into new builds. Any view on that with your COTA hat on?
Well, I do support a tax reform, a significant tax reform across the board. I don't believe we should have piecemeal tax reform. I think now that the Labor Party, has a clear mandate for some years to come, I think they have an opportunity for significant tax reform, and it's time to do that because everything has a use-by date. And really, we haven't had wholesale tax reform since the Howard Costello government of the late 90s with the goods and services tax and all the other taxes that were abolished as a consequence. We've had changes.
Some not abolished in the end.
Well, you have to ask the New South Wales government about that. We abolished our taxes. I was there. I'm not saying federal, I'm just saying
all
the states did their
such as payroll tax was my point. But yeah.
Well, that's true, Tom, but you have to take that up with the state governments.
So, but on CGT then, yes. You'd be open to that.
However,
as part of a...
I also believe that people who've made plans based on certain tax regimes, which certainly older people do because they are looking at retiring or retired, they should not be affected unilaterally by government policy in which they didn't have any say, and therefore grandfathering of tax changes to things like the capital gains tax would be a position that I'd be more likely to support, because it means that people who've made arrangements based on the current laws, which has always been a basic tenet of reform in tax, are not affected.
Finn McHugh from Capital Brief.
Hi, Christopher. A couple of months ago, the government watered down its plan to tax superannuation accounts above $3 million. I'm wondering how you think that plan would have affected the people you represented. But you just made the case for broad and deep reform. What do you think the back down itself says about the chances that we're going to get this sweeping reform in the next couple of cycles of government?
Well, I think my answer before really pertains to that too, which is that reform is fine as long as people who've made plans based on a certain tax regime have the opportunity to be grandfathered. And I don't think that was the case with the reforms that Jim first announced around superannuation. I'm fortunate to be on a defined benefit scheme as a person who got elected in 1993, so those particular changes didn't affect me. And of course, people with balances of over $3 million are a minority, clearly, in superannuation. But because if they've done well, and they obviously have, if they have such high balances, everyone should pay their way in our society to pay for all the things that we need to pay for, many of which I talked about in my speech. But if there is to be reform, the people who have done that in the past shouldn't be affected by new law changes. And maybe that's part of the future that Labor will offer in some sort of tax reform to make people pay more tax, which Labor tends to usually do, but they should grandfather that for the people who've already made their arrangements.
Next question, Zach De Silva from AAP.
Hello, Mr. Pyne. Thank you for your speech. You mentioned leadership earlier, and maybe we can go there now. As someone who has worked in and around politics for many, many years and brings a lot of experience to that area, you've worked with a number of PMs. What does Susan Lee need to do to get herself out of the current malaise that she and the Liberal Party are in? And would you ever consider a return to politics? You know, you're a fixer.
Well, I left politics when I was 51, which is actually very young, but I was elected at 25, which is also very young. So I'd spent more than half my life in politics, which seemed a bit weird. So I thought it was time to get out while I was still young enough to do something new. And it's been great, I have to say. I keep an interest in politics behind the scenes, but I don't interfere. I don't hover. But I'm happy to support my former colleagues. In terms of leadership, so the answer is no. I have no intention to return to politics. I think my wife would have a lot to say about that. A lot. If she's watching now, she'd be thinking, no way. Expletive deleted. In terms of leadership, it's not so much what Susan needs to do, who's actually been doing a perfectly good job as leader of the opposition since the election. It's what my former colleagues really need to do, which is to give her clear air and an opportunity to be the leader. Since May, there's been an endless public dispute. My former colleagues probably need to stay off the television and the radio unless they want to talk about the Labor Party and the government. Their job is to oppose the government and to point out its deficiencies, praise them when they're right, criticise them when they're wrong. It's not to endlessly talk about the internal dynamics of either the Liberal Party, the leadership, or the coalition in the press. So I think that's obvious, and I'm hoping that they'll start doing that, letting Susan be the leader with clear air to land blows on the government, which is what the public want her to do too, and I think the public want her to be given the clear air to do that. That's the first thing. But I can also say that this is not unusual for the Liberal Party in opposition. I was elected in '93. Between '93 and '96, we had Brendan Nelson, Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott as leader, and in 2010 we arguably won the election. The only reason we didn't form government was because the two former Nationals supported Julia Gillard to remain in power. So disunity is death, but unity on election day is more important than any other time in the electoral cycle. And then in 93, 96, I got the dates around the wrong way. We had 93, 96, we had John Hewson, Alexander Downer and John Howard. And in 96, we won the election in a landslide. And then in 2007 to 10, we had the other leaders that I mentioned, and we basically did win the election, except we didn't form a government. So, I mean, you'll all say, well, you didn't form a government. But obviously, we didn't form a government. But 3 years later, we did in 2013. So disunity is obviously bad, and the public don't like it. But at the end of the day, it's not unusual. The Liberal Party is the managerial party. That's how we see ourselves. Opposition is anathema to Liberals because they have nothing to do. And they start to do other things because they have nothing to do. So I understand what my colleagues are going through. It's very painful. And they just suffered the biggest defeat since 1943. So let's cut them some slack, because they're obviously, understandably, feeling quite traumatised. But the best method to deal with this trauma is to keep it internally inside the party and talk about it amongst your colleagues, but it's not to endlessly talk about it on the ABC or Sky or Nine or in the Australian.
Thank you.
Those two phases, though, maybe suggest it's time to start cycling through leaders, because it worked well those two times.
That wasn't my take-out, Tom.
Jason Katsoukas from the Saturday paper.
Chris, welcome back to the Press Club. It's great to see you here, and I think we all miss you up on the hill, so a return to politics would be welcome from the media's point of view. I wanted to ask you about the implementation of the New Aged Care Act. What are you picking up about how that is going, in particular the Support at Home program? Are there any ongoing problems there with regard to the implementation of that program that you would like to see the government modify or change tack on in any way?
Thank you, Jason, and nice to see you as well. Nice to have you here in Australia. Well, it's pretty early days. The implementation started on November the 1st. You would expect the government to take some time to bed down issues. We are seeing at COTA issues like sharp price increases because of the way some of the reforms are being interpreted on the ground, longer waiting lists to receive what I used to call home and community care packages, but supported care at home, longer waiting lists blowing out in that kind of care, pressure to sign contracts quickly for older people, despite the fact that they, according to the changes, should have 90 days in which to make decisions, but they're being pressured to sign those earlier. And then there are some of these issues that are becoming sort of totemic, which is the list of things that are on the critical care requirements for older people that don't include, for example, showering, which I mentioned in my speech. And because that's such a thing, of course, it gets a lot of coverage and a lot of complaints. So there's some of the things that we're seeing, and we expect the government will react to those over time. But it's now, just the beginning of February, so it's only really had 2 or 3 months to bed down. And they are talking to COTA, to our excellent CEO, Pat Sparrow, and her team, Corey and others who are here, and I'm sure they'll react well. The government has been very responsive to COTA's engagement on all these reforms, and I expect that will continue.
Thank you.
Lexi Genowick from the ABC.
Thank you, Mr Pyne, for your address today. And just returning to the Liberal leadership at the moment, I'd just like to clarify, have you spoken with Susan Lee in recent days about the split? And are you concerned that the time that's being spent, both in the media and up on the Hill, on this split is taking away from holding the government to account and Liberal policy that could be used to benefit the older Australians that you have spoken about today?
Well, there's no doubt at all that the ongoing drama involving the coalition and the leadership speculation is distracting the opposition from holding the government to account. It's sort of plainly as obvious, and that's a big negative, and the Australian public are reacting by telling us how they feel about that through the polls. I don't believe the polls as they exist now will be the polls on election day in 2.5 years' time. But the polls are an interesting thing as a former politician or practitioner of politics, as I was for many years. They do tell us a snapshot of time of what people think. It doesn't mean how they're going to vote necessarily on election day. And people use polls to express their displeasure or their pleasure. And that's why straight after elections, the Prime Minister usually gets a bounce in the polls because people think, well, we voted for him or her and we hope they're going to do well, so we'll say something nice about them when we get rung by a pollster. Similarly, the people are telling the coalition, the non-Labor side of politics, that they need to get their act together, and that if they don't, they are saying they might consider voting for One Nation. So One Nation's had obviously an enormous boost in the polls. Whether that follows through to election day remains to be seen. But there's no question that the ongoing endless discussion about internal dynamics is distracting from holding the government to account. And there are lots of things that the opposition should be holding the government to account for, and one of them, of course, is policies for older Australians. And so COTA Australia, is concerned about that. But the ship will right itself, and I'm certain by the election the ship will have righted itself. And I speak to a lot of Labor people, because I'm a lobbyist now, of course, as well as many other things, and they also think that they want a strong opposition because it's good for government. Bad opposition is bad for government, and they know that as well as anybody else does. It's also bad for democracy, but in terms of the practitioners in government, they know that a poor opposition or an opposition that's distracted from holding them to account means that they will get complacent and they might get lazy and they might make bad decisions. So it's important that the opposition does right the ship.
Thank you. And just to check, no direct conversation with Ms.
No, I
Lee?
haven't spoken to Susan in the last few days, no.
Thank you very much.
No.
Lucinda Garbutt-Young from the Canberra Times.
Thanks for your address, Christopher. I'd like to ask your opinion on the government reforms to the Defence Department. They were announced last year. In your view, has Defence historically been too bureaucratic, and has procurement been badly affected as a result? Perhaps there were quiet conversations about this when you were in Cabinet. What's your view on the restructure, and do you think an agency will handle it better than a bureaucrat?
It's a good question. When I was in the defence portfolio, which was 3 years, I'd never met more experts, armchair experts, on defence and national security and what the government should be doing. And usually they're retired military people who think that things should be done the way they used to be done when they were in charge. So all the criticisms of the government and defence, the Department of Defence, about national security and procurement, I always run that ruler over, because it's always been the case, back to Roman times, that people are always unhappy with the Department of Defence or the military or national security. The projects that Defence has to manage, the scale is mind-boggling. Things like the submarine projects or the Hunter-class anti-submarine warfare frigate or combat reconnaissance vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, Ghost Bat, Ghost Shark, the F-35A delivery and so forth. These are not like going to the Bunnings and getting a new watering system on the weekend. Right? These are the biggest projects in Australia. Many of them, the submarine project is the biggest project ever attempted in Australia. Bigger than any new mine, bigger than Olympic Dam, bigger than mines in the Northwest Shelf. So you wouldn't expect that to be run perfectly, and so I congratulate the government on reorganising the Department of Defence. We've seen many reorganisations of the Department of Defence over many decades. I hope it doesn't slow things down while there's the reorganisation going on. I know the public servants on Russell Hill, the uniformed and non-uniformed people who manage our national security. They are good men and women, and they're doing a very good job, and they should be left to do their job. That won't happen, of course. People will always keep tinkering and suggesting things. I think the government's largely got defence procurement right in the last almost 4 years, and I think they'll continue to do so. But in terms of the changes, an agency versus the former CASG, Capabilities Acquisition and Sustainment Group, or Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Group, or Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Group, have all been put together into the new agency. Whether that's the answer, it remains to be seen. It does remind me a little bit about the Defence Materiel Office, which we changed, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe longer actually. I think Robert Hill did that, so it's even longer. When you get old like me, you know, time starts to rush past quickly. That could be ageist, though, so at least I'm talking about myself. So it remains to be seen. It's too early to say.
Andrew Green from the Nightly in the West Oz.
Mr Pyne, after that answer, I'm tempted to ask you who you think should be the next Secretary of Defence.
I did tip Greg Moriarty to be the ambassador to Washington.
That's two of us.
I thought he was a good choice. I do think he's a very good choice.
But I will return to another answer you gave just before about One Nation. And in your home state, your former sparring partner, Corey Bernardi, has now announced he'll be running in the upcoming election there. Can you give us your prediction for the success of that party, given that you were in Cabinet when One Nation first emerged and John Howard had to deal with that phenomenon a long time ago?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is the One Nation party of today is not like the One Nation party of 25 years ago. And I think a lot of people still look at it through that prism. It's changed a lot over the years. Pauline Hanson, Senator Hanson, has been around politics since 1996, off and on, so almost 30 years. And she has gained a great deal of experience over that time in how to, appeal to the voters of Australia. So we are seeing a stabilisation of One Nation's vote, and we now see, I think there are 4 plus Barnaby, 4 senators in the Senate from One Nation, and plus Barnaby Joyce. So we're seeing the benefit of that for One Nation, and they have quite a lot of representation now in state, upper houses particularly, and I think that will continue. And One Nation has dropped a lot of its less palatable public pronouncements that were made back in the 1990s and the early 2000s as the party has matured. And I think they'll do relatively well into the future. Whether they'll get 26% of the vote or not, it's hard to say at 2.5 years from an election. I'd be very surprised, because I think the coalition will right the ship, as I said before, by that time. And if Cory Bernardi wants to go back into politics, good luck to him. It's a democracy, it's a free country. I'm almost certain he'll get elected. One Nation won one legislative councillor at the last election, and I'm certain they'll win at least one legislative councillor at this election. So Cory Bernardi will be back into the upper house, and great. He and I grew up in the same street in Undulkara Road, Burnside. I joined him up to the Young Liberals, and we used to play together as children. So I bear no animus to Cory at all. I don't agree with all of his views. I don't intend to go back into politics, but if he wishes to, good luck to him.
Daniel Holmes from the Mandarin.
Thanks for that, Chris. I want to see if I can get you to fix something for me. There's
every chance.
Well, there's something that I've been hearing quite a bit from members of the disability community about the recent machinery of government change to the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing. Their concern is essentially that the department is overloaded. It's got too much on its plate now with disability on top of anything, or on top of everything. And there's also the concern for some elements of that community that lumping them in with health is treating their condition or their life status, if you like, as a temporary state. Is that something that's coming through in the aged community as well?
Well, it does come through in the aged community in terms of the sort of arbitrary cut-off of 65 when people are treated differently depending on whether they have a disability or not in aged care. In terms of the machinery of government, the machinery of government is an ever-changing thing. I'm sure that Anthony put the NDIS in Mark Butler's portfolio because Mark Butler's a very competent minister. And as was predicted many years ago, when Julia Gillard formed the NDIS, it is a very complex phenomenon and has confounded many ministers since its introduction, and it continues to evolve, is a nice expression. So I'm sure Mark Butler's been given that job because Anthony, the Prime Minister, believes that he will fix some of the issues in the NDIS. I do, though, think the NDIS does not sit well in the health portfolio. I think it is a universal service, like childcare is a universal service or education is a universal service, and disability, treating people with disability well in Australia and providing services for them is not always a health issue. Sometimes it is, so it should be recognised as such, but other times it's not. So, but that might well change. I'm sure if the Prime Minister and the Minister for Health and the NDIS and his team think that that is better served being separated out again, he will separate it out again. And yeah, that would be.
But as to ageing, should that be in a similar category to disability in this respect?
Well, ageing cuts across all the portfolios, as I mentioned: transport, employment, connectivity.
But only one has ageing in its name.
Well, what's in the name?
Fair point. Thank you.
Michael Percy, Spectator Oz.
Thank you, Mr. Pyne. My question is about ageing policy.
Goodness, how exciting.
You mentioned social connection, and you also spoke about co-design and a national research program. One of my issues with ageing policy is we have working people born in the 1950s and now 60s. They get to age 63, they can't work anymore, but they can't go on the pension. So there's this gap. People in their 50s now can't access their super until they're 60, so there's this gap. At the same time, ageing policy designed by stereotypes has an elite sort of progressive bias where, and I've given lectures at retirement villages which look fantastic if you're into that kind of lifestyle. Many of these working people aren't into that kind of lifestyle. They want to be at home in their own house with their pets, meet their families, that's their connection. But our policy doesn't really focus on them, and they seem to be the people you mentioned who are missing out. So my question is, the people who would be interested in co-design will probably more likely be progressive left-leaning. The national research program will be conducted by left-leaning progressive academics, probably. How do you make sure that you can actually address the people who really need ageing policy to reflect their choice in how they age and how they live?
Look, it's a good question. I wouldn't adopt the pejoratives that if people are from the left, it means that they're going to have not very useful views in terms of policy. I do, as I said in my speech, the policy, the action plan for ageing Australia over the next 10 years should be designed with older people, not for older people. And that process needs to be a genuine one, and it can be. And I also said that we need to have the flexibility in the workforce, in employment, to keep older people working for as long as they wish to. And that should not be as hard, especially because of COVID, as it used to be. One of the only good things that came out of COVID was that people can work from home and prove to be quite productive and stay in the workforce for longer if that's what they choose to do, in the same way as they could stay in the workforce when they had to stay at home because of COVID. So I think that does give us a model of flexible working, but I wouldn't overemphasise that, because you also want older people in the workforce because they provide a tremendous mentoring role for the people around them, and you don't want to lose that skill, that opportunity. So policies have to be designed to be flexible, to meet all of those requirements, and they can be. And the same with aged care, the same with home and community care packages or supported home care. That's what this proposal that COTA has put forward today about a 10-year plan for ageing Australia is all about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In terms of the stat you gave, I think it was 33% retiring before they wanted to. And I suppose the cliche, you know, a factory shuts down and the media asks the 30-year-old bloke with the kids, what are you going to do now? It's pretty easy for them usually to retrain in some way. Mm-hmm. You lose a job at late 50s, early 60s. These are meant to be high earning years, no school fees. You know, this is often when you're quickly squirreling away that money. When you're trying to convince workplaces, you know, COTA, you as in broadly COTA, is there resistance? Do people hear an argument, hire older people and go, actually, what were we thinking? Is the reality once they do that they think, you know, this ageism didn't make any sense? Is it just getting people to, you know, take the leap, if you will, and then the argument's won?
Well, I think the reality has to dawn, or the penny has to drop, whatever cliche we wish to use, that the idea that Australia would have this great wealth that meant that people could retire young and we lose those people from the skilled workforce, that is not viable. The debate that goes on in Australia right now about migration, for example, and is not one that fits with people being able to retire as well. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? We do need more skilled workers. In defence alone, in construction, the prices of constructing anything in Australia, whether it's a house in a suburb or whether it's a stadium in Brisbane for the Olympics, is all going up, because you can't get the workers that you need. You can't get workers in Sydney today, relatively unskilled tradespeople for jobs, lots of skilled tradespeople, relatively unskilled ones, so young ones, for less than $200,000 a year. And MPs get paid about $239,100 as their base salary. I've always watched that carefully. So we're talking about an incredible cost in construction. So you can't say we're not going to have imported skilled workers or even unskilled workers, because we have this debate about the fact that Australia, which is bigger than continental United States and only has 27 million people, is apparently full, which is obviously not right. We have more water than France, and they have about 74 million people. So all those things aren't true. But that debate is affecting things like our migration program. And then we also want people to retire whenever they feel like it or early, and say you should be able to do that. So, and you know, we're not having children as much as we used to because we're a Western country, and Western countries around the globe are suffering from, or experiencing, not suffering from, but experiencing lower birth rates. So all of these things are combining to bring a day of reckoning. And in my speech, of course, I talked about the need to keep older people in the workforce for longer for a number of reasons, all of which are positive. And getting rid of ageism, of course, is critical to do that, because of the 33% of people who said they retired early, 22% of those said they'd done so because of ageism in the workforce. And so we actually have to address this from an economic point of view as well as a social point of view.
Nick Stewart from Ability News.
You've referred to the problem of intergenerational conflict, young versus old. You've also, in your speech, you began by talking about the diversity of a single cohort like the aged, that they represent wealthy people, incredibly poor people as well. Is the issue that needs to be addressed by government that some of our programs are incorrectly focused? So, for example, you have disability care focused on people who get onto the NDIS before they're 65, and rather than their needs at a particular time of life, so that we're focusing on the individual rather than the block where they happen to be born, what their age is, etc.
Yes, well, Nicholas, it's nice to see you again. You used to come and ask me questions about national security, so you're very flexible. The age... As
I grow older, my concerns have
Well, I've taken
changed.
up yoga in my retirement, so I've become very flexible. Much more flexible than people in the class realised, I have to say. A little ageism there too, actually. I'm quite good at yoga, but let's not get distracted. The arbitrary age of 65 is arbitrary. It bears no relation to any data that indicates that should be an age, a limit, or a particular point in time, a punctuation point for policy. It should be removed. The services that should be able to be accessed by people, whether they have a disability or whether because they're ageing, should be based on what an individual needs, what services they require, which ones the government has chosen to provide and which ones they've been asked to provide themselves, and the age itself should be removed.
Thanks.
Short and sharp. Well, Christopher, we thank you very much. I know you've seen your offices nearby. You get a gold membership, so you can pop by any time.
I've already got a life membership or something of the national. Oh no, it can't be life.
I don't think it's life.
No, it must be just a...
Anyway, this will help you get in the door and get a gin and tonic. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Christopher Pyne.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
There you go.
That's very kind. Thank you.